Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks again for joining today's Deal Flow Strategy with SoGal Ventures. We have Elizabeth Galvett here, co-founder and managing partner with us. I'm Vanessa Samaniego from 500 Startups. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to join. So in the meantime, feel free to check out the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We're going to be monitoring the Q&A at the end, so that way we can address any questions that you have for Elizabeth. So let's just give it about a minute, and then we'll get started with the official intro and get the webinar started. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you once again for joining us here today. We're excited to welcome you to today's Deal Flow Strategy with SoGal Ventures with Elizabeth Galvett, co-founder and managing partner. So our webinar will also include a fireside chat with Christine Tsai, CEO and founding partner here at 500 Startups. For those of you who just joined, my name is Vanessa Samaniego, and I am in charge of operations for 500's investor education programs. We'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. However, I kindly ask you to use the Q&A function that we have at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring that. So just to give you an overview for today's webinar, Elizabeth will be presenting for about 15 minutes on SoGal's deal flow strategies. And then our fireside chat with Elizabeth and Christine will also be about 20 minutes. At the end of the webinar is when we have slotted about 10 minutes for the Q&A. And before we get to the webinar, I wanted to speak a little bit about our upcoming VC Unlock Silicon Valley online program, which is why many of you are also here today. We run this program every year in collaboration with the Stanford Center for Professional Development, which we'll be holding this fall. This program will be online, so it will be virtual. And we'll also drop a link into the chat, so that way you can learn a little bit about the program by visiting our website, education.500.co/Stanford. The program is going to be taking place this October. It'll be October 4th through the 29th. And the early application deadline, as well as our diversity scholarship deadline, was extended to next Wednesday, June 30th. So you have a little bit more time if you're interested in the application. We are offering 2 full diversity scholarships. One is reserved for a person of color and the other for a female investor, which we are offering in partnership with SoGal. So thanks again, Elizabeth, for helping us out there. Please remember that this is the first step. The first step for the program is to have a peer or colleague nominate you. So be sure you have this taken care of as soon as possible, so that way we can then send you the application. The program is really designed for serious investors who want to strengthen their skills and abilities to define, negotiate, and execute at early stage investments. So feel free to always send us an email if you have any questions to vcunlocked@500startups.com. And with that said, I'd like to hand it off to Elizabeth now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I'm so happy to be here. The VC Unlocked program was actually where my business partner, Pocket Sun, and I first met. So we basically kind of owe everything to the 500 Startups and Stanford program. because it's not only where we met, but one of the speakers during the program, Jason Calacanis, who's a big angel investor, he was the one who actually encouraged us to think about starting our own venture firm. So at the time I was graduating from grad school, as was my business partner Pocket, and we both had been, applying for different VC jobs or thinking about if we were going to sort of start a startup. But it was this really interesting time in the industry. It was right after the Ellen Powell Kleiner Perkins case had happened, and there was a lot of discussion about what's the role of women and other traditionally underrepresented individuals in venture capital. And it was a really interesting moment. Can you guys all hear me? I know Nisha says I need to speak a little louder. And it was a really interesting moment because now there's so many new fund managers coming to market that are, VC managers that weren't traditionally represented before. And that's so exciting. But at the time, about 5 years ago, that just wasn't the case at all. There was only a handful of us. Christine was really, one of the women leading the charge with 500. And it was so inspiring because at this program, I had never been around, more than 1 or 2 women venture capitalists. But the program made it a point to have women in the room. So there were 13 women in my cohort. And for myself and Pocket, that was just absolutely incredible because we never had that network before. And we walked into the room and there were these women that managed their own funds and made all of these investments. And it was just this incredible sort of having the role models there with us for 2 weeks, and becoming friends with all of them was so amazing. And it really did help me think about what are ways that as investors could we have deal flow. And so when we started our fund at SoGal Ventures, we're really focused on women and other underserved individuals that the venture ecosystem traditionally doesn't serve. And we would go and meet with lots of existing venture capitalists who, traditionally most of them are white men, and they would all question us, right? We were 23 and 25 at the time when we just started, and they said, there's no way there's enough women to sort of make your investment thesis work. There's no way that you can go and make money on this strategy. And so for about 1.5 years, we actually really needed to work on our self-confidence and sort of proving out that our investment thesis was one, not only that we saw value of, but that we could actually have data to point to others of that value. So we started doing things. SoGal actually started as a global community for female and other underrepresented founders. So we started putting together a global pitch competition with sort of the idea of let's see how many startups we can get to apply so that we actually have data around the types of startups that we would invest in as a fund, so that when we get that objection, right, from other VCs or potential investors in our fund, we can actually point to like, look how many amazing deals there are out there. So when we first started this global pitch competition, we did it in 12 different countries, and then we brought everyone to Silicon Valley, the finalists. And within 3 months, with really no brand name or brand recognition, we had almost 700 amazing startups apply. And we put really interesting constraints on it. They couldn't have raised more than $3 million of venture capital. They wanted to go raise venture capital, or were already trying to. They had to have at least one woman co-founder, and it needed to be at least 50% women owned from an equity perspective, the business. And these were companies coming from all over the world, all over Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, the US. And it was really incredible because then at the global final pitch competition we ran, we invited a bunch of other VCs, many of those who had said, there's no way you can find this many women founders. And so we brought them to this full day event, and we had, I think there was about 30 different women founders pitch. And multiple VCs at the end of the day came up to us and said, wow, this was better than like YC demo day. Like the quality of these companies was like better than anything I see at YC. And like they're all women CEOs. Like I didn't even know women CEOs like this existed, right? And we were like, yeah, of course they exist, right? You just don't know the right networks and you don't know how to find them, or you haven't been, putting in the effort to try and get into these networks and find them. And that's, the exact thesis of our fund. And by having that data and sort of some of that feedback, that was as our fund, right? Kind of our minimal viable product. If you think about it from like you're building a startup, which building a fund is in a sense, building a startup at the same time. And so from there, we really had, found some interesting founders that we either wanted to invest in or we already made some small angel investments in. And at the time, I was also building a student fund at Johns Hopkins, where I had just graduated from grad school at. And so we were starting to invest really little amounts of capital into these companies, but we really wanted to make sure, like, are we actually good investors? Do entrepreneurs actually want to take our money? Do we actually know like what to do with the entrepreneurs after they take our money? And like, if they take our money and then they go raise from a really big name VC, do they still want us to continue to invest in their companies because of the value we provided? So at that time, I mean, Pocket and I, we were doing anything to just get this done. So I was like tutoring ACTs for $300 an hour in New York to be able to make like $1,000 angel investment. Pocket was career coaching individuals and looking at people's resumes to be able to make angel investments on her end. Then I took like a part-time professor job to be able to have a little bit more cash so we could just be investing. And we really learned early on from both that and also kind of the student fund I had started that was writing $10,000 to $25,000 checks, that even a really small amount of capital can be incredibly impactful for these founders, because it really gives them kind of this outside validation that somebody really believes in them. And it gives them also their own self-confidence that this is something they should be doing to pursue their startup full time. And that if they can get, one or two yeses, they can go and get many more yeses down the road. And that was something we would help them with. And so about a year and a half after the Stanford program, we were like, okay, we finally believe we have, checked all the boxes that people will take us seriously. By that point, we had invested in almost 30 companies between the student fund and our angel investing, and many of them had already gone on to raise follow-on rounds. And we said, okay, we're going to go and raise SoGal Fund 1. And we targeted $15 million. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot right now, but back then, for like two young women in their 20s that didn't come out of, a top VC firm, had not really, been in venture before, that was like a very, very big target. But we had said, we usually hit whatever goal, we think we're going to hit. So like, let's be ambitious and let's go for it. And it was really, really hard. It took us over 3 years and 99 investors later to raise that 15 million. You can only have, the way we had set up the fund, 99 investors. There's a legal sort of implication of that. So we really cut it close with how many investors to get it there. But it was really important to us for us to be able to start investing in these companies as we saw a different deal flow, because we were just seeing so many interesting companies that just were not getting attention from the major VCs because the founders didn't look like, Mark Zuckerberg. And to us, we saw they had traction and revenue and all these things that as a VC you look at and you say, wow, this is a really great business. And we also saw this really interesting thing, because they weren't able to raise capital as much, they had really good capital efficiency. So a lot of them already knew how to have, the products almost profitable, like on the first purchase, because they had to, because they didn't have, a huge amount of money sitting there that they could burn through as a startup. And as we started looking at more and more, we started developing more sophistication around how we thought about deal flow and how we really sorted through it. Because what was really interesting is kind of like, once you start investing in this network of founders that traditionally doesn't get all the attention, sort of, it's like the floodgates just open, because all of a sudden, right, like, and I think we got so much attention kind of in the press, in media, at conferences, because we were kind of some of the only people doing it at the time. It's different today, but back then, like even our tiny checks were really, really notable because they just weren't happening otherwise. And so one of the things I think as you're building your career as an investor is to think about what you want to be known for, and how you want founders to think about you and your firm if you're building a firm, or if you're just angel investing, you as an angel investor, and making that really authentic to you. So for us, really, we represented a lot of the same sort of journeys that these founders were going through. We were young, we didn't have, the brand name stamps behind us. We hadn't, worked at Google or Uber, and we hadn't, worked at Sequoia. We didn't have those logos, just like a lot of the founders we were, looking at didn't have some of those logos for whatever reason. We were fundraising for our fund, just like the founders were trying to fundraise for their businesses. And we had a lot of empathy for them and could really, understand them and have real, authentic conversations with them as we were evaluating the business. And that really created a reputation for us that kind of started spreading through the startup ecosystem, where people wanted to talk to us, not because we could give them huge amounts of money, but because even within a first conversation, we could have a really authentic connection to them where they felt seen and heard, and that somebody actually, took the time and cared about what they were building and who they were as individuals. And we've always loved that kind of like grit in different people from different backgrounds and the stories behind that. And I think that early on was kind of a big part of our deal flow. And then we started thinking like, how can we sort of institutionalize this into processes, as we grow? So we continued, doing that global pitch competition. But we also thought about, SoGal has global chapters around the world of entrepreneurs and investors. How do we make sure sort of the startups in each of those ecosystems are flowing up to us so we can see those deals and talk to the best entrepreneurs in each of those local ecosystems, and think about investing in those ecosystems and, have on the ground knowledge. We have SoGal chapters now in over 50 cities in 22 countries on 6 continents. So of course, Pocket and myself aren't experts in all of those different ecosystems, but by having SoGal chapter leads and SoGal communities in those places, I saw a few SoGal chapter leads on the call, so shout out to all of you guys. We can have better insights about what's going on in those different markets and the different opportunities that exist and the different founders in each of those markets. And then we really did a lot of, we never hired a PR firm or anything like that, but like any opportunity that came to us about press or speaking, we took, because we never knew who we were going to meet at each of those things. And we never knew who our message would resonate with, but we just wanted to put ourselves out there as much as possible to kind of get the word out, and just meet interesting people, whether they could be investors in our fund, or it could be potential entrepreneurs we could invest in, or just people that cared about this mission too, and wanted to help in whatever way. And I think in the beginning, that was a really big piece for us. And we did get a lot of critical feedback of like, why are you out there so much? You should be, focused on investing, or, focused on just fundraising and doing it in a very sales-like process, or you should, you're putting yourself too much out there for kind of how small of checks you're writing. And like, that's going to be embarrassing to you later on. So we got a lot of critical feedback, but for us, we knew it was really important to talk about these things. And very quickly, we also became kind of the go-to for a lot of corporations, where they were thinking like, how do we engage with millennial and Gen Z women? Like, oh, SoGal knows about that. So we actually have a few corporate investors as part of our first fund. And a big part of that was because we were out there doing all of these sort of talks and press. They saw us as thought experts on millennial and Gen Z women. And some of these corporate partners are super, super aligned. For example, Macy's is one of our largest LPs in our fund. And we were able to actually bring 12 of our SoGal companies to Macy's during the holiday season and give them in multiple stores 3,000 square feet of retail space where these traditionally direct to consumer companies had never tried out retail before. And this ended up being able to where they could do data and analytics around, does it make sense for them as a startup to go into resale or different wholesale distribution channels? And it helped a lot of those startups answer questions that they had but didn't really have a mechanism, right, to try out. So there's ways as an investor too that you can kind of, right, connect your investors in the startups you're investing in to really be helpful in that way too. And I think, the traditional ways that people think about deal flow is, other investors giving you referrals, other founders giving you referrals, people from high-tech networks giving you referrals, right? And then doing research on interesting theses that you care about. So for example, I care a lot about healthcare. About a third of my 90 investments are in healthcare, and I've done really well in healthcare. So I research a lot of interesting topics. Like last year, before COVID, one of the topics I really cared about was death care in the death space. And that, isn't a topic that many people talk about. But for me, it was something I was really, really passionate about. And I did a ton of research. I had interns doing research, and we were talking, right, to all the companies in the death care space to figure out which ones we wanted to invest in. So I think as an investor, you think about deal flow as kind of like what's coming into me, right? And then like, how am I also putting myself out there to find the things that I'm looking for? And some investors do this really well. I think we need to do this a little bit better of like actually communicating outwardly of what things they really care about. So for example, something we're putting together.
Thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I wanted to jump into the fireside chat where we can continue exploring a little bit about this with Christine, who will be leading this next part with you. Thank you again.
Of course.
Well, I think there's a lot to dig into, Elizabeth, because you talked about so many interesting things. So I will just have the honor of putting you in the hot seat a bit. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be doing this fireside chat with Elizabeth. As you can tell from what she's already shared, SoGal Ventures is a really unique, one-of-a-kind firm, and we're so honored that Elizabeth and Pocket met at VCU. Hopefully more of these matches made in heaven happen through VCU. But I guess, Elizabeth, one thing, I guess, to kick it off, on the website, many of you have seen, if you took a look, the firm is described as the first female-led next generation venture capital firm. And then I'm going to go into a little bit. We believe in the power of diversity, borderless business, and human-centric design. We focus on early-stage diverse founding teams in the US and Asia, and aim to be the strongest ally for portfolio companies. My sense is that that provides a window into your investment thesis. Tell us a little bit about what your investment thesis is specifically.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because we made this about 5 years ago and it hasn't changed much. So the top line of the investment thesis is how the next generations live, work, and stay healthy. So that's anything consumer tech, that's anything health tech, and then enterprise software, but really focused on like how we all work. So right, like remote working would be something that kind of falls under that, or flexible workforces. The next sort of subtopic of our thesis is, like you were saying, Christine, global first, borderless businesses. So Pocket and myself, we had lived and studied and worked in 6 countries between the two of us before we even started SoGal, and we had tried our hand at a bunch of different languages. And Pocket's originally from China. She was living in Singapore while we were raising our fund. She's soon to be living in Canada. And we really knew a lot of others in our generations either came from immigrant families, were immigrants themselves, or were just people working all over the place with, individuals from everywhere. And that perspective is so important when you're building a company today. And we really knew there's some interesting research about millennials, how many consider themselves global citizens before they say their nationality is what they sort of ally with first. And that was something we really believed we wanted our founders to have different experiences in their lives that kind of went to this part of our thesis. And that as VCs, that was something we could really help with. So thinking about going global for a company is really complicated, and there's 100 ways you could do it wrong and probably only a few ways that help make you even more successful. And it can be anything from, having a distributed workforce to manufacturing in different countries to actually then selling your product, right, in multiple countries and expanding your market share that way. And that was something we really wanted to help our founders think about, and to utilize our SoGal network to actually help them make those strategic decisions about when was the right time to use any of those levers. The second sort of sub-thesis part was really about being design-driven businesses. So I have a master's in design, and I was a professor at the School of Visual Arts in New York for their Products of Design graduate program. And it's not design just like, oh, this is pretty. It's design of, do you really understand the problem you're trying to solve for? Do you really understand the actual users or customers that you're building a solution for? And how did you get there? So something we always ask founders a lot about is sort of like, how did you discover this problem? And once you discovered it and now you're proposing the solution, how did you validate that? How did you build that? How did you come up, and what was your process? And there's a lot of differences between like just market research, like putting a survey out there, and as a startup saying, hey, I went to 100 different households with my prototype and I had them play with it and touch it in their hands and give me feedback, and I iterated my prototype from there, and here were the 5 learnings I had, and here's how I changed my product to get that, and now I feel super confident that we have product market fit and can scale. So that was something that was really, really important to us. And then community-based brands. So SoGal, we're a community first, that's how we started. And we also have always believed, and now this has kind of become a trend, right, over the past couple of years, that community is what drives a lot of these sustainable businesses and marketing. As things like Facebook acquisition and whatnot becomes more and more expensive, having an organic community that not only advocates for you but also perhaps even co-creates what you're building with you is really, really important. So I know that sounds super, super specific, but at this point, we're seeing this year over 50,000 deals in 1 year, and we're only investing in 10 to 15. So it is really important to us to stay kind of true to that investment thesis. And I would say all of our companies that we invest in meet all those criteria.
Nice. How about your actual check sizes, stage, target ownership, follow-on strategy? Tell us a little bit about kind of this construction of the portfolio.
Yeah, so when we first started, we were writing $50,000 to $100,000 checks. Now we're writing kind of $350,000 for first checks, up to $1 million once we do follow-on. For our next fund, we're actually trying to raise $100 million. And the big idea behind that is we've seen a lot of these diverse founding teams really struggle raising their pre-seed and seed round. And oftentimes it may take them years to cobble together, the $2, $3, $4 million that, let's say a white male founder goes into a fund, gets one fund to say yes and a few of their buddies over text to say yes. All of a sudden, the guy has $6 million and he's ready to go on and build his business. We haven't seen that be the case for many, right, women or other traditionally underrepresented founding teams. And we want to be able to be, right, that firm that can say, hey, we're writing that $2 to $3 million check. We're going to bring in a few of our friends to give you, that $4 million round. And now you can get back to business instead of, having to cobble together $10,000, $15,000, $5,000 checks for the next 2.5 years. Because it is really important for a startup, like how long they've been around in a lot of investors' eyes. And they are getting compared to, right, other startups that have different financing histories. And that comparison is super unfair, right? If somebody gets $6 million out of the gate, of course they're going to be able to build something faster, hopefully, right, you would hope, than if, they spent 3 years trying to fundraise while also building their business and they only had $1 million of capital to build their business in the first place. So we really want to, at least for the founders we're investing in, kind of make it a more level playing field. And we think, we're in an excellent position to do that. So we're excited for our next step of our journey too.
Well, so far your track record, especially for first-time fund managers, is really promising. First two deals that you guys did have became unicorns within 3 years. Tell us a little bit about some of the highlights in the portfolio and who are those unicorns and what you're seeing as the portfolio matures, especially with a year like 2020 and COVID.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Both of our first two investments, we actually committed to the investments kind of before we even got our first check in the door of an LP commitment. We were waiting for all the legal documents to be done. We were like, faster, faster, we need to write these checks. So the first company we wrote an investment to, Function of Beauty, is a custom hair care and skincare company, but I really think of it as an advanced manufacturing company. So they're able to produce one-off custom products at sort of a mass manufacturing price. And I had actually come across this investment on Facebook. I was just browsing Facebook. I saw this as a product. I ordered it for myself. And after I went through the ordering experience, I was like, this startup is going to be huge. I'm going to respond to my order confirmation email and be like, can I please speak to the CEO? I'd like to invest in this company. And they wrote back because they were only a 3-person team at that time. So they were all doing the customer service emails. And it was actually before we even had a fund, and they were profitable on all their products from the first purchase. So they weren't doing a lot of fundraising themselves. And they said, hey, when you guys are ready, come back and we'll figure something out and maybe we'll raise around then. So about 6 months later, I called them back up and I'm like, okay, we've got the fund put together. We're like ready to go. And they were like, well, we don't really need to fundraise. And I'm like, come on, please. Like, I really, really want to invest in your company. And they're like, okay, we'll open up a $1 million round. And, we still didn't even know, like, our first close was about $1 million. We had a very small first close. And as a venture capitalist, you don't call all your money up front from your investors. So you don't actually get, right, like $1 million in the bank usually. When you do your first close, you only get a portion of that. So we didn't even know how fast this money would come in. So we kind of had to think like, how much can we even invest in this $1 million round? And the founder called us the next day and said, well, Bessemer wants to take the entire round. So I need to know the answer today of how much you're going to be able to put in because, they are ready to wire the money today. So it was really this interesting time pressure. And then the founder came to us a week later and said, we have 3 term sheets for Series A at double the valuation you had invested in. Who should we pick? Who do you think we should pick? So that was this really interesting kind of whirlwind of an experience where we were like, oh my gosh, we have to get all of our stuff together to be able to even access this round because like, we may not even have the money to wire them until, their Series A money is being wired, and that won't work, obviously. And that is a really interesting company because they actually raised very little money until the most recent round. They had raised under $15 million total to get to over $100 million of annual revenue because they had such amazing, economics behind, each order. And it's a really great business fundamentally. And they grew incredibly fast. Like they had over 300 employees within the first 3 years. And so they just raised from El Cateron, which is LVMH's private equity arm, around $150 million round at $1 billion valuation. So that was just this really exciting moment for us because we had actually sent the deal to a lot of other VCs when we first got started. And they're like, oh yeah, you're the girls who do hair care. Yeah, you're real tech investors. You and your shampoo and conditioner, go ahead, enjoy yourselves. And a lot of those investors now are kind of like coming back to us being like, okay, maybe you were right and we were wrong. And that feels really good. And then our second investment, Everlywell, which is at-home lab testing. And actually during the pandemic, they were the first at-home COVID test that was approved by the FDA. So that actually came out of, we run some small dinners of different women investors just so we can get together and talk about different deal flow and what we're doing. And at the dinner, one of the female investors said, hey, we're doing this deal. And it had been sort of the idea of Everlywell and at-home lab testing for a variety of conditions, not just one. There were a lot of companies that, were only screening for X type of cancer or only doing STD testing, for example. And if you know anything about, acquisition costs for startups, to me, it made no sense that like you're spending all this money to acquire a customer and then they only have, that one lifetime value for the one time they're doing a test. So I had always been looking for kind of a platform approach of like what could actually replace a lab that somebody could use, dozens of times over their life, and that would be the true winner in the space. And I just hadn't found it. And then the woman at this dinner mentioned the company and she's like, it's oversubscribed, the round's closing. And I was like, no. Like, I have to do this. Please introduce me. And the founder, Julia, was so sweet and polite to all my emails. She was like, like it's oversubscribed. I'm sorry, I don't know you. Like, and I basically just kept begging and pleading. We had both worked at Deloitte before, and I was like, come on, we both, are green dots, we're Deloitte alumni, at least call with me, and so finally she took a call with me and I was like, how about press? Do you need press? Let me like go get you a bunch of press. And she's like, okay. And so I started connecting her with reporters and different podcasts and getting her a bunch of press. And then she was kind of like, okay, you're actually helpful. Maybe let me ask my board member if he's willing to kind of put his investment down a little bit to give you guys some allocation in this round. So it was one of those, again, that I really, really fought for. But I'm so glad I did. And she's actually an LP in our fund now as well. But her company is now worth $2.9 billion in 3 years. And they're doing hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, which we're so excited about. But I think, again, with both of these companies, to me, it's always important, like, what are the companies actually doing and are they adding value into the world? So with Function of Beauty, I had done a lot of social media research and a lot of women had said, I've bought 30 shampoos and conditioners. They're all just sitting in bottles under my sink. They don't do what I want them to do. And there were even some women that said, like, I've had dandruff my whole life and I've been afraid to wear black. And finally, after, using Function of Beauty, I can wear black with confidence and go to a job interview. Or, there were mothers that said, like, this is my one kind of like spa moment of the whole day, away from my kids where I can just be me. And this is like such an amazing product for that. And I know that sounds all kind of like trite, but like those are things that actually, make a difference in a woman's life. And to me, that was really important. And then the same thing when I was thinking about, lab testing and how many of us don't get lab tests because we think they're going to be too expensive or we don't know how much they're going to cost if, we're uninsured or have a high deductible plan. And kind of having that affordability and accessibility. And as women, we're often not listened to by doctors, and we're not even given access to the tests that we may want. So the ability to actually, do the test yourself when you're saying, hey, I'm fatigued, I'm gaining weight, I don't know what's going on. Those were things that all meant a lot to me beyond just like the business opportunity. And so I think as an investor too, thinking about like what means a lot to you and what are your values. And, as an investor, you get to, if you want, extend those values into the company that you're investing in.
I think that's something that is a really important takeaway for everyone listening. If you heard Elizabeth talk about how she like fought her way into deals, went and hunted them herself, like that is exactly what managers should be doing. I think there's this perception that the great firms, deals just come to them and they have the pick of the litter, but actually, Elizabeth is one of many, but there's a lot of examples of some, Midas lists, like Midas list VCs, some who have spoken at VCU that really have gone and done pretty much what Elizabeth has done. Like, let me into this deal. Like I'm proving their value. And that's exactly what she did. She proved her value and was helpful. And that's something that from the founder's perspective, they really care about, especially at the early stage. They want to see VCs that can do more than just write a check. So I think that's something really notable. I guess like that kind of hits on how you're sourcing deals and how you get into these deals, but it's really like winning these deals is one of the hardest things in that whole funnel. So
And
I
think
imagine that
talking
that
to
there's a lot of
startups,
stories like that, right? I think we only have a few more minutes, so I just have a couple more questions. One I think is interesting to point out for many listening, because I think this comes up a lot too, in terms of building a partnership. So Pocket is someone you met in BCU, not someone that you had known before. I think that it's not unlike startups and co-founders and choosing a co-founder. How did you make that? I guess what was kind of that mental calculus in terms of deciding to work together versus going at it alone, and how you complement each other, and then what you would recommend to people who are considering how do they find a co-GP or not?
yeah. So when we were there, we were like, oh my gosh, all 13 of us women should like band together and do something. And all the other women were like, we already have firms and funds and investments, like no. And so we were kind of the two youngest, the two most inexperienced there. But we kind of had been doing very similar things while we were in grad school. So she had been starting SoGal as a student organization at USC. I had been running an entrepreneurship organization at Johns Hopkins and building that into a student fund. And both of the core concepts were around the arbitrage opportunity of investing in founders that like the main market is ignoring. So Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore. For those of you that don't know, Baltimore is not a capital rich city. Not a lot of investors care about Baltimore or go to Baltimore to try and source deals. So for me, that was the arbitrage opportunity of investing. I call it Stanford talent, Baltimore prices. And Pocket had been, looking at women and other underrepresented founders while she was at USC. And both groups really needed money and access to capital. And at the time, sort of her path was a little unknown. She didn't know, was she moving to Singapore? She didn't really have her visa worked out in the US. I was moving from DC to New York. I had a startup with my best friend at the time that I was like, I'm going to have to, potentially break up with my best friend in order to do something with Pocket. But it all kind of worked out, but we were really, really intentional about it. So we were like, let's work together for a year. Let's continue building the SoGal community. You start building your student fund and investing out of that. Let's do some angel investing together. And let's basically like make sure before we take a lot of other people's money that we actually like investing, right? So building a fund, it is a 15+ year commitment. And partnerships break up all the time, but like I think it's important that you really trust and respect anyone you're getting into business with. It definitely makes the route a little bit easier and people more comfortable to invest in you. So we were really deliberate, especially because of our age, that we wanted people to take us seriously and that we had to be super intentional about like our own process of the two of us as co-founders in order to kind of be able to project that outwardly so that people could take us seriously.
Yeah. And that goes to my last question. It's kind of unfortunate that but this is the reality that for different types of fund managers, there's considerations that they make and things that they have to adapt to that typical, kind of the stereotypical fund manager doesn't really even think about. So you mentioned yourselves, you're both women, age, didn't have that track record necessarily. So I'm sure a lot of those LP conversations were, went a certain way, but I'd love to hear, like, especially for many listening who have kind of as emerging fund managers and, again, don't fit that profile, what you found really worked well for you in terms of the fundraising process and pitching LPs as first-time managers.
Yeah, I think for the first couple of years, we kept trying to change people's opinions of the world. And it's very hard to change an individual's viewpoint on the world. It's much better to kind of create a huge funnel and find people that have a similar worldview to you, because those end up being the ones that say yes. So I think, right, for the first couple of years, we were trying to educate people on diversity and educate them about why diversity is an investment opportunity and why they'll make a ton of money investing in diversity plus, social good. But trying to convince or educate people who it isn't really something they care about yet for the most part doesn't work. And you can spend a lot of time and energy and frustration trying to do that, where if I went back and tried to do this all again, I think, right, I would focus on the people that already were prepped and primed and were like, yes, women are important. Like, yes, diversity is important and I care about it. And like, maybe I don't know anything about venture, but then you're not arguing like kind of your thesis and worldview. You're just, seeing if venture is the right fit for somebody in their investment portfolio. So I think find people, and this may mean you have to have a huge top of your funnel, but really spending the time and energy focused on the people that already at least kind of share your worldview is the biggest tip I would give others.
Mhm. Yeah, awesome. Well, I will hand it back to Vanessa for looks like some nice Q&A coming in.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
thank you for being such a huge role model for us. You're one of the original OG women in the industry.
Oh, no. Still learning, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for leading this part with Elizabeth. Like Christine just said, we have great questions in the Q&A. So Elizabeth, I'll take this back with you. One of the first questions I think ties in to one of the reasons why we're here today as well. But someone wanted to learn a little bit more about how the VC Unlock community continues to be part of your journey today.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously I found Pocket, but I also found a lot of LPs for both of my funds. So, we've gotten over probably $1 million+ of commitments coming from just individuals that were part of the program with us for either SoGal or for the student fund that I had started. And then actually we've gotten people we've worked with kind of outside of just, on the LP side or co-investing side as well. So one of the women with us has this amazing company, SheerTex, and she was one of the companies we put into Macy's. So she went from kind of being on the investor side to being a startup operator years later. And, we reconnected on that. And of course, sharing deal flow. But I think, a few individuals in particular have become amazing sort of mentors. And actually even some of the teachers, I still have text message and WhatsApp conversations going with them. So for example, on one of our investments, we had an opportunity to sell it as a secondary. And this was something that, it could be a multiple outcome for our fund, but I also really believe in the company and, think it has a lot further to go. And so it was a really hard decision. And it was one that with one of my mentors from the program, I was immediately able to call him up and talk through, all the different implications and ways as a fund manager I should be thinking about it. And how I should be thinking about it for my LPs. So I would say it's just been invaluable and amazing.
Perfect. Thank you. I know I'm in a lot of those group chats too, and it's pretty fun with the different time zones. When I wake up and I see that there's a lot of messages going on with the community. So always fun to see the deals that come through there, the events, the collaborations.
And then also I've referred a ton of people to the program. So I don't know if any of you know Lolita Tab, who's now doing community fund. One of my other business school friends, Jade, she runs a real estate fund. Now that she started after doing the program, we've had a lot of our SoGal chapter leads go through it, and they've all just had such amazing experiences, and many started their own funds afterwards. So I think it's a great launch pad, and all of them have also had similar experiences of, finding a great network within their, cohort.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. A big part of that is thanks to you and everyone who is able to speak to the program firsthand. Another great question I think here is if you have any hacks on resilience and overcoming limiting beliefs when faced with obstacles or defying the odds, which I know you mentioned in your chat today was something early on.
Yeah, so I think for the first 2 years, it was really, really hard for us. And we were growing up at the same time that we were kind of doing all this. And, I'm really impressed with everyone who runs solo GP funds and kind of goes out on this on their own, because I think Pocket and I were really able to support each other. When one of us was really down, the other one could kind of be the cheerleader and lift the other person up. like looking back, if I didn't have that, I think it would be, incredibly hard, if not, I don't want to say impossible because nothing's impossible, but I think that was such a positive in having a partnership, was we were able to help each other come up with our own limiting beliefs. And then I'm also a huge fan of, mental health, wellness, therapy, coaching. We have programs that our nonprofit runs that are actually 6-month peer groups for our founders around mental health and wellness, because I think, if you're raising a fund, you are an entrepreneur in itself. And entrepreneurs face, a variety of ups and downs in any given day, month, year. And I think you do need support. I forget who said this to me, but it's kind of like you are a sports car. And like, if you are a luxury sports car, an F1 sports car, you have a pit crew, you've got a team around you, you've got engineers, you've got people who are like ensuring the car and you as a driver's success. And like, if you're trying to build something like this, like you do need a pit crew and team around you, and mentors, advisors, coaches, people that help you with your mental health. And I think, right, we think athletes always have that. In other different types of professions, right? If you're like a doctor, you're getting a lot of mentorship from people around you, like in a residency program, right? Like you need that as an entrepreneur and fund manager as well. And like, there's no shame in, taking the time to do it. I think it actually, right, helps you grow even further and faster.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. I think even what you said, the peer mentorship aspect is really huge for a lot of our participants and people in this space, since it can be a bit lonely for founders and the fund managers as well.
Yeah, I keep just hearing like it's hard. And like if other people are having the same hard experiences as you're like, okay, it's not just me. I'm not the failure here. This is just really hard for everyone. And I think that, is really helpful in having that peer group.
Absolutely. I think we have time for just maybe one last question, so we can wrap up on time and be respectful of everyone's time. But I think a good question here is, first of all, they say thank you for the inspiration. But secondly, their question is, looking back, would you have done anything differently in your journey?
I think I can say this now, but right, like it's very hard to like actually think about it back then, is like, I wish we had, more confidence and hadn't maybe internalized so many of the negative sort of sentiments we got from everyone. And I think even today we still get a lot of like, well, how do the two of you do all this, right? And a lot of times that's feedback from an LP who perhaps like their job is, a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. job, and that's what they do and that's the lifestyle they have. And so like the even thought of like, our lifestyle and how we build our business isn't comprehensible to them because, they can't see themselves doing it. But I think, especially at the beginning, we took a lot of this negative feedback to heart, and it weighed very heavily on us. I wish we kind of would have had a little bit more confidence in ourselves.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I know that we're not able to get to all of the questions today, but thank you again to everyone who was here, who participated. Of course, thank you, Christine, for the fireside chat with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today, sharing your insights about deal flow strategy, your origins, and where you're coming from. So it's, I think, a story that so many of our participants today relate to. And so for everyone who attended today, we'll be sending out a recording. So you'll be able to catch up on things that you might have missed at the beginning or just rewatch it at your own time. We'll also be hosting another webinar on Thursday, July 7th with a Stanford faculty member. So keep an eye out for that information. And finally, we just want to remind you that the early applications and scholarship applications for VC Unlocked, we extended that deadline. So it's going to be due next Thursday. And just again, we need a nomination first from a peer or colleague, and then we'll be reaching out to those who we would like to have a follow-up conversation. So we'll send you an application at that point once we review your nomination. And then the last step would just be the interview, but just be sure that you have that all in by next Wednesday. And with that said, thank you again for being here today. If you have more questions, reach out to us at vcunlocked@500startups.com. And we wish you a lot of luck in this admissions process. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. We need more investors like you, so do it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much, Christine.